Good morning. My name is Maurice Crespi. I'm the managing partner of Schindler's Attorneys. Schindler's Attorneys is a co-founder of COBRA. COBRA is an initiative that was founded by Schindler's Attorneys together with Engaged Business Turnaround and IQ Business. And we now have over 75 partners who are there to provide assistance. They provide assistance by way of meetings with you and your team. If you need legal services, if you need accounting services, financial services, they are all provided by our partners, either on a shared value basis or, if required, on a gifted value basis, which means that if services are required and you cannot afford those services, they're there for you. Part of our offering, these webinars, we have these webinars periodically, once a week, and they on issues and topics that are informative and that are invaluable, particularly when it comes to businesses in the current climate. Today we'll be dealing with cybercrime. We have a panel of experts who will be taking us through steps that one can take, preventative measures. You know, we were, as Schindler's, struck by ransomware about 3 years ago. It'll be very, very interesting to hear what their perspective is, because we were told by experts at that point in time, do not pay a third of a Bitcoin as ransomware. Do not set a precedent, rather submit to it and lose all of your data, which I felt was absolutely ridiculous. So at the time, a Bitcoin was about 8,000 rands. It was still cheap, and we paid 3,000 rands to sort the problem out. And the consultants who told us not to pay the ransom charged 120,000 rands. So that's quite something. To introduce my panelists, who do we have today? We have David Loxton, who is part of Africa Forensics and Cyber. He's the CEO. It's a company that he founded and is doing exceptionally well. We have part of the service offering is they assist law enforcement agencies with the criminal aspects stemming from his investigations. Furthermore, Dave has worked with local and foreign tax law enforcement agencies, heading up various teams, investigating complex cross-border cybercrime matters. He's armed with years of extensive experience in forensics, and he now offers clients these expert services through his private company, Africa Forensics and Cyber. He's also an accomplished speaker, appearing regularly on TV and radio. He is frequently quoted in the written press on all matters related to economic crimes, compliance and regulation of cyber crimes. Then we have Mary Faulks. Mary has extensive experience in enterprise and entrepreneurial development, having developed Pan-African programs and worked with entrepreneurs across the African continent. She was also part of the team who launched the first EdTech and biotech incubators in Africa and worked on programs focused on tech enabling for women. And finally, we have Claus Tepper, who's the Deputy CISO for ABSA, looking after cyber operations and engineering. He's a seasoned security expert with over 20 years experience in tech and cyber. He led the cyber separation program during the Barclays and ABSA separation. So we truly have some leaders, they the top of their game. So I'm very, very excited to hear them. Guys, thanks so much. If you guys can come on.
Morning, all.
Hi. Thanks, David.
Morning.
Thank you. I don't want to kick us off, but I did mention my little example. I'd ask that you guys deal with it, because that's actually quite an ethical conundrum.
Yes. All right. Well, let me. The way we're going to run the morning is I'm going to kick off the proceedings, go through a brief presentation of a few slides. I'm then going to hand over to Claus, who's going to deal with some practical case studies that I've been involved in. I just selected at random. Then we're going to go back to me with going through the chain of custody, which is a topic very dear to my heart as an ex-prosecutor and a litigator. And then we're going to deal with questions. So that is the format of the morning. So in line with the new normal, let me now share my screen and show how astute I am at the risk of exposing myself with technology. So that'll be the first thing I need to get right is my presentation. All right, we seem to have that up on screen. I hope that please shout if I am not my slides are not being seen.
No, we can't see it as yet.
Not. Okay.
No.
Because I've got right. Here we go. That.
Yeah, we can see it.
Can we see now? Good
Yeah.
stuff. All right. So you see, I did expose myself to being deficient in the new normal. All right. So what we're going to discuss this morning is practical advice regarding cybercrime. I'm a lawyer, and I'm well aware that when lawyers run through legislation and regulations and all those nice things, it is a recipe for curing insomnia. So we decided not to go that route this morning. We're going to try and be as practical as possible and work on the assumption that all of you who are attending this talk have either personally been hit by cybercrime, or you know someone who's been caught by cybercrime, or you just are one of these people that's very well aware of what's going on by reading the news and being online, etc. Because cybercrime, most of you should be aware by now, is the crime of choice of the syndicates and the criminals. The proceeds of cybercrime now are outweighing the proceeds of normal white-collar crimes, fraud and corruption quite substantially around the world. So it is something one needs to be aware of and something which affects all of us. So where we are now, we're 7 months into the COVID virus lockdown. We've been through various stages and we've all had to adjust. There's good to it. We're having more time with our family. The bad side of it, of course, is increased business risk. We've heard the term an act of God, and those of you who saw my talk a few months ago will remember I alluded to the movie, The Man Who Sued God. What do we do now? Do we sue God or do we mitigate our risk? And that's what we essentially will be talking about this morning, is the risk of cybercrime and how one mitigates that. So the new threat, systemic. Business has always been structured for an office environment. You know, you take a traditional office, it might be that your business has offices in different centers, it might be Johannesburg, Durban, Cape Town, but essentially you've structured for an office environment. So your IT department has set up your controls and your risk mitigation systems, and they assure your systems are like Fort Knox. Of course, that's no longer relevant. Years of tried and trusted protocols aren't working anymore, and they're no longer of any force and effect. Instead of your employees being in an office environment, they're logging in from home. Some people working at home will have routers that they wouldn't have looked at other than setting it up. They wouldn't have tried to change the password. Others might have changed the password, but both of them are logging onto your system. You might, while your employees are working at home, they might have kids who are online gaming, sharing the same Wi-Fi system as themselves. So your risks have been changed, shall we say, and changed in a very negative fashion. Your business is structured, as I say, for office, and now we've had very, very quick, unplanned for changes. No one could have predicted the speed of the change. No one had time to plan. Very few businesses are agile enough to have changed overnight. When you're working at home, you have family pressure. You know, you've told your wife how hard you work. Now you're sitting at home and she sees that you actually don't work that hard. You also have pressure where your family is now saying to you, well, now you're at home, come, let's do lunch. Come, let's take the afternoon off and do something as a family. So all these different pressures are now affecting people. There's the social pressures, and of course, the financial pressure is the worst of the lot. We're seeing reports in the financial media of layoffs, retrenchments, over 2 million people directly affected by the COVID virus, losing their jobs. And of course, that then has a direct effect on people and puts pressure on them to try and supplement their income. And of course, one of the easiest ways is to commit fraud. The fraud triangle is a well-known concept. If one looks at it in the context of COVID, there are opportunities because there's less supervision. As I say, people working at home. There's enormous pressures with downsizing. People might have taken pay cuts. They're back in to come out. And of course, we always have the rationalization. someone who commits white-collar crime, in their head or to their friends, they'll rationalize that they've done so much for their company over the years, it's time for payback. People find it easy to rationalize. So the fraud triangle still applies, and the technology creates the loopholes and the opportunities. As I've said, with the change in the environment and the different risk profiles now, there's enormous opportunities for the bad guys to come on board. So COVID is a breeding ground for fraud. What we're finding is digital payments are now being used for everything from groceries to electricity bills to taxi fares, everything. People that used to shop online maybe once every 6 months for some software or something digital are now paying for everything digitally. And that, of course, increases the risk hugely because of the lack of controls. And generally, people are not very aware of security. Just think of people discussing purchasing a new cell phone. All they're interested in is the latest phone having the state-of-the-art cameras, the ability to stream. And the last thing they think about is the security of that cell phone, which in fact should be top of mind and the most important factor when choosing a phone, especially for business purposes. What we're also seeing is a spike in fraudulent insurance claims because, as I say, there's enormous financial pressure on people to come out, and insurance is always seen as a soft target. So, you'll see these absurd claims where someone will go jogging and then they will then put in a claim saying, well, I decided to go jogging and I wasn't wearing my Garmin running watch. I was in fact wearing a Rolex when I was mugged, and I'd taken my wife's jewelry with me just to check on it while I was jogging because I quite like looking at her jewelry. So all that was stolen as well when I was mugged. So these kind of claims taking place, which are absolutely absurd, but the insurance industry is obviously a very soft target, and they've seen a huge spike in these fraudulent claims that they have to deal with. So I like to think of it as a recipe. What we've had enter onto the stage in the last number of months is a novel virus. At the time that the COVID virus hit, no one knew really what to expect. We didn't know what to plan for. We didn't have any idea what the impact would be on our personal circumstances, our work circumstances. So it was totally novel. We had history, the Spanish flu and all those other nice things, but this was a new virus. And obviously when something is new, very, very difficult to plan. Add to that then, because it's so novel and unknown, there's a huge amount of anxiety around the world, both within communities, in businesses, in individuals, in families. And anxiety leads to a change in behavior. It leads to an absolute change in behavior. People no longer act rationally when there's huge angst and tension. We've seen what was added to the mix is the enormous destruction in the economy of not only South Africa, but worldwide, and a massive plunge in confidence in business leaders, in politicians, and of course, Joe Public. Still, we're all sitting in the position where we don't really know how to plan for the future. Do we plan to go away in December? Do we plan to have our normal summer holidays? Do we plan to go overseas? It's very, very difficult to plan ahead when we're having this environment we're in. That often induces not only the anxiety we've already spoken about, but panic, and people, as I say, act irrationally. And then you have your predatory fraudsters. Sadly, whenever there's a catastrophe, whenever there's an act of God, like a tidal wave or an earthquake or COVID virus, it's amazing how overnight these scams spring up. There'll be these fake charities offering assistance that they will help people, and they're asking for donations, and it's all fraudsters, not actually acting for the good of the public, but actually for themselves. And of course, there's the optional fraud prevention program, which is something which we can talk about in due course when we talk about mitigating risk. So let's go on to the treats that we see. And as I said, I've simply chosen at random the kind of cases I've seen and I've been involved in, personally investigated and advised on. And this will then lead into Claus giving the practical answers to these particular case studies as to how one should react and how one deals with it from a technical point of view. So a simple example, company allows job applicants access to its own website, and they can then post their CVs and their job application. So as opposed to the normal process of sending a CV by email, they can access the company's website directly. And this then, of course, allows the bad guys access. There's insufficient control on that particular website, and it allows a hack. And the bad guys then take control of the website. And that can then lead to a redirection of individuals to a fake website. And as you can imagine, that can be used for all kinds of nefarious means. Simple one would simply be gathering people's information. Because on your CV, you'll not only have your contact numbers, your address, your qualifications, but it allows a whole lot of other things as well. It allows the syndicates and the organized criminals to then build up profiles of people, and having that information can be enormously useful, and it's very, very valuable on the black market. So that's one example of how things can go wrong with a company seemingly being efficient and using technology to its and individuals' advantage, but of course it backfired. Second one, I'm sure many of you have seen phishing attacks where you receive a phishing email. So in this particular matter, which I was asked to advise on, financial director of a company received an email from a provider advising of a change in the bank account. He then paid over R1 million to the incorrect account, and that account was cleaned out and shut down literally within 2 or 3 minutes from the money landing. It was taken out, and that account was then shut down. It was a result of a simple phishing attack. What was interesting to me was this particular company did have security in the form of Mimecast. So those of you that know Mimecast will be aware that Mimecast gives you warnings. So in this particular case, Mimecast did pop up a warning saying, warning, suspected phishing attack, wording to that effect. The user ignored that. According to the company, the reason it was ignored was simply because the settings on Mimecast are set at a minimum level, which means the warnings came up too late. In other words, it needed, I think, 3 or 4 phishing emails before Mimecast would kick in. There was a lot of interaction with Mimecast and the external service provider advising the company on their systems. And of course, everyone was running for cover. Mimecast claiming that in fact they did give the warning in time. The company was saying the warning did not come in time. But the bottom line is they fell victim to a phishing attack, and which cost them over R1 million. And the prospect of recovery is literally zero, because that account was cleaned out within 2 or 3 minutes, and the fake IDs of the individuals, they were fake, so you can do nothing with it. The third one is very, very common. Syndicate paid people to hand out flash disks. So people would arrive at the workplace, at the office, and there was a very friendly, smiling stranger standing outside saying, here's a flash disk, enjoy it. The average person then goes to their desktop or their laptop and says, brilliant, let's see what's on this flash disk, or I can use it for storage. And that way they plant malware on their laptop. They go into the intranet, and then the syndicates now have access to the whole business through the server, which they then took over. And that then can lead to, as Maurice mentioned, the ransomware, which we're seeing huge spike in lately, is organizations being held to ransom. And this is through the simple act of friendly strangers giving free flash disks to individuals. Then the last one, which is probably the most complex to deal with as an investigator, was an employee used their cell phone to take pictures of sensitive designs and drawings. So an engineering and software company, the employee very painstakingly over a number of weeks used their cell phone and took picture after picture of sensitive designs and drawings, which they then sold to a competitor. And the competitor now had access to the company's intellectual property with their designs and drawings. And unfortunately, it was done via WhatsApp. And those of you that use WhatsApp will be aware that WhatsApp has serious encryption. So as an investigator, very, very difficult to investigate. So those are just 4 examples of matters that I'm aware of, that I've been involved in personally and advised on, just to give you an idea of what you as an entrepreneur should be aware of, sensitive to, and the kind of issues that might arise in your business. And I'm then now going to hand over to Claus to then deal with these particular matters and advise you on the proper way of dealing with them and how to mitigate your risk. So Claus, I'll log off and hand to you.
Great, thank you, Dave. Just sharing my screen. So Dave, just stop sharing the screen on your side, please.
Yeah, I'm busy.
That,
Stop share. Yep, I've got it. There we go.
all right. There we go. All right. All right, I'm assuming you guys can see my screen. All right, I'll take that as a yes. All right, so I think just want to, just quickly, and I think Morris has introduced me. So yeah, I'm Claus Tepper. I'll quickly get through this. I have a number of technical certifications that I've achieved over the years, and many years experience in cybersecurity. I'm passionate about cybersecurity, especially the technical aspects, and that's why I'm here to really impart some of my knowledge and share that with various businesses and individuals out there. Just a disclaimer, I am talking from a personal capacity here, and the views and the advice I'm sharing here does not reflect that of my employer or that of Absol or in any association with them. So I want to talk about the first case that Dave did bring up, and that's effectively where the a website is hacked that hosted CVs, and I want to actually expand on that and say, look, this applies to many other websites, and it could be as easy as a website where you're asking someone to contact you, so that there's a form where they can fill in their details, and that ultimately is an email to you, and in some cases it'll store it in a database, and I think with legislation, Poppy comes to mind. I'm not going to go detail into that, but there is a requirement that you have to look after that data and apply the necessary controls to ensure that it's protected. So even a simple form like a contact form requires you to make sure that you take the due care and due diligence and apply the right controls to protect that information. Some practical advice. Sorry, some other sites that come to mind are like this, the sort of job hunting site where individuals can upload CVs. And I think the site's also vary in complexity. You could have a site where, again, that CV is just emailed off, and other sites where there's a database built up over years and years and years on the website that is stored on the system. And then other sites are shopping carts, payment systems, or more shopping carts that often hand off to a payment system. But again, you've got a lot of personal information that's stored there, and that requires protection. There's a lot of software out on the internet that you can easily access and download and install. Common and well-known sites for content management systems. The two that come to mind that are well-known and often exploited is WordPress, and then Magento is a shopping cart system. Those are often exploited and easy to exploit. And I just want to quickly touch on some advice on what you can do and consider if you host or have one of these websites, what you need to do to make sure that you have some of the basic controls in. So I think whenever you build a new site, you have to just take some time, sit back and think about security. And we always recommend, depending on the complexity of the site as well, you need to do some security testing. Now, there's two forms or obvious forms of testing that you can look at. There's a vulnerability scan, and there are, you can ask your technical provider to do a very basic vulnerability scan that can just, the very, very minimum, do a scan, look at what the warnings or the flaws are that the system identifies in your system, and address those concerns. And then there's also penetration testing. That is a lot more complex, and especially for more complex sites where there's a workflow and intricacies that could be exploited, that is something that I'd strongly recommend that you do consider. But it does come at a cost, and you do need experts that are well experienced in the space to look at these sites. I think some other considerations is you want to reduce your attack surface. So, in the example of a contact form, get the data off the server, email that out to your email address. Look, you have to think about email security as well. But once it's emailed and once you've received that request for someone to contact you, if there's no point in keeping that data on the server, then don't keep it there. Perhaps clean the logs out, or not the logs, but clean the database out. If you can move it off on a month-to-month basis, clean it off or remove it off site, and just limit that amount of data and the exposure that possibly you could have on that system. Then further to that, if there are services running on the server, And this could be a server that you run, or it could be a server that you pay for a hosted provider to run. But if there's services or software, and especially when it comes to WordPress and Magento, or these content management systems, if there are plugins or themes that are activated on those websites that you do not use, turn them off, uninstall them, because having them on just creates that additional leverage point or point of entry for an attacker that where they can actually compromise it and break in. Then lock down sensitive web addresses, your login sites, sites where you perhaps do have a link to a database or a file that's a flat file sitting on the server that only you should have access to. Ensure that those are locked down and that you require strict access control to those. There's some security guidelines by the content providers. Do the research, understand what are some of the basic tips and security guidelines that they have that you need to follow. For example, on WordPress and Magento, there are certain folders and things on the server that they will tell you, lock this down, and they'll give you some practical advice as to how you can do that. I think, and I'm going to touch on backups a bit later on again, but in terms of ransomware, and Morris, you mentioned it earlier, the best advice against ransomware is to back up your data, and that includes your website. There is malware and attacks out there that target websites where they ultimately take your website for ransom, and then you have to go and recover that, but back that up. And when you back up, think about the data that is in your backups and where the data goes and how the backup is secured as well. Changing default credentials. WordPress, Magento, many of these content management systems comes with default usernames and passwords. Admin password. Make sure that those are changed. That is often the easiest way to get in. And I think based on my previous talk, one of the most common ways still to access systems is by compromising a set of credentials. And then limit your administrative users. If there's a user that wasn't administrating the system that's no longer with the organization, disable the access. And then there are some cloud-based services out there which you can actually, you can configure. Some of them may require some payment or subscription fee at a very low cost, but you can actually point this at your website and say, monitor this website for me. And if this website changes, notify me immediately. And then when you have that notification, it gives you the ability to take the appropriate action to get that site or that system taken offline, and that then actually do the necessary from a response point of view so that you can secure the data for litigation if it's going that route, but at the very least you can then also respond and get your business back up and running, and I think we'll touch on that a little bit later as to how you can do some of that. And then just an interesting stat, it's and this is a stat from this year, more than 73% of WordPress sites that are out there are outdated and are vulnerable. I had a check, and the latest version of WordPress, there are no known vulnerabilities to it, but if you look at older versions, they are very vulnerable. So it's imperative that you constantly update that server software that hosts your website. Moving on to the next one, social engineering, and I think this is where the financial director was convinced to, here's the invoice, pay it, and ultimately the invoice was altered. I think whenever a supplier comes to you and says our banking details have changed, or you pick up that banking details have changed, there are other channels you need to rely on to validate, have these changed. So practical advice is maintain a good relationship with suppliers. If there is a change of banking details, confirm the change of the banking details with a known contact from that supplier. And then you should also question, would well-known companies that you've worked with over a long period of time and that have kept their bank account details the same for a long time, would they change that without upfront and proactive communication around the change of banking details? Have a look out for impersonated email addresses. It could be, a business abc.co.za is who you normally deal with. Look out for businessabc.com, which could be an impersonation. And again, always, if you're not sure, call the service provider on a telephone number or an email address that is valid and that you have engaged with them in the past. Scrutinize invoices and speak to anyone that handles payments to scrutinize those invoices. I think a lot of these business email crime, the ploy or the part of the social engineering tactic is to really put the person they're engaging with under a lot of pressure and create this context of this is urgent. And they want to instill this panic in the person that if there's no response, there's going to be consequences. And I think the actual advice there is to instead of speeding up, just slow down. And think about it. Look for the regularities. Make that 1 or 2 phone calls before you pay over any monies. And then protect private information. Supply invoices, communications, any documents that you know in your day-to-day business where there is personal information or payment information. Don't just throw it in the bin. Shred that information or store it and keep it for safekeeping for as long as required, and dispose of it appropriately when you need to do so. If your business is targeted, do alert your customers to any scams out there. If you're compromised in any way, it might be prudent to go out there and say, look, just be aware that we have a scam where a fraudster is changing our banking details, and just get a narrative to your customers really quickly around what the position is, what your banking details are, or just reaffirm that the banking details haven't changed so that you can stop any further fraud from happening. And then you can always contact an insurer to see if there is an insurable loss if you have fallen victim to this. It's something else you can consider. Just from a statistics point of view, given January, Feb, and March, there's an increase of 75% in business email crime or email compromise. And what we've seen in April and May, what the statistics suggest is that it spiked up to almost 200% in this type of fraud. Moving on to malware or the USB stick, and I think it's a very well-known ploy that if you want to introduce malware into an organization, just leave a memory stick in the parking lot, just drop it on the floor. Someone, especially in the morning, will probably pick it up, walk into the building and plug it in. And I think as per the example, it's a syndicate. It's quite easy to get someone to stand outside the building and hand out memory sticks. So as a general guideline, do not trust digital media, and that doesn't just apply to memory sticks. It applies to DVDs, CDs, any form of digital media that can transmit data. Just don't trust it if it comes from an unknown source. An obvious one, have anti-malware or endpoint detect and response software or services deployed across your environment, so that if there is malware introduced into your environment through any means, whether that's through a USB or through email, that you're able to pick up on or get an alert and detect it and evaluate that, and then ultimately respond to eradicate any malware or unwanted software in your environment. Patch your computer systems with software updates. Microsoft, Adobe, Java, those are the especially Java and Adobe. They often release updates on a regular basis, and those are some of the software where that's easy to get into your system. So make sure that those updates that for a licensed user, is for free of charge, and especially with Microsoft Windows, you can set up the updates to run automatically at certain times. Make sure that those updates are configured to install. And if you have a business where you're centrally managing it, make sure that you are centrally pushing out these updates to your computer on a regular basis. Then why CDs and USBs are so easy to introduce malware with is that Windows does have an auto run feature, and the whole concept is when I put the CD or the DVD in, it automatically starts playing that video, or when I plug the USB in, it automatically starts running the program. One thing you could do, and again, it's a policy you could push out to all your devices, or if you don't centrally manage your devices, consider applying it on each individual computer, or have your technical guru do that for you. But disable the auto run feature on some of the CDs and USBs media. So if that USB stick is plugged in inadvertently, then at least it doesn't start executing automatically from that USB device. Run regular scans across the network for any malicious software or unwanted software. I think you need to consider any applications where your data is, where your critical data is stored, and store those activity audit logs and security logs. Make sure those are turned on, and not just turned on for a period of 30 days. You might want to go back almost 2 years in some cases to investigate a crime. So make sure that the necessary auditing and the access logs for your critical systems are turned on, which will ultimately enable and support the detection of of these events, but more importantly, the investigation of it long term. There is software out there that you can use to secure USB drives. So you can say certain USB drives you will allow, and certain USB drives you're going to lock. So if you have the ability to spend some money, and USB devices are a concern for you, consider software that you can deploy to really lock down USB drives, if people don't need them. I think the world has also shifted. We're definitely seeing a reduction of USB drives being used, and cloud and file sharing sites are definitely picking up. And then backup. Again, ransomware. If you've fallen prey to ransomware, there is a slight chance that there's some way that you can reverse that, but the best defense to ransomware is to back up your data. Sites like Google Drive and OneDrive, if you think at some of their commercials or look at some of their commercials offering, you will see that they have versions that they will keep for you. And that could be considered as adequate backup, because if your primary backup is considered, you can ask them to roll back to a previous version. Then data theft. So I think this is the tricky one, and I think in Dave's example, this is WhatsApp. And I think the point that I want to also get across here is once it's on WhatsApp, you really lose control of that data. And it's quite a challenge, because everyone is using WhatsApp. It's so easy to use WhatsApp, and it works. It's really very effective at communications. But when data and messages are put into WhatsApp, okay, it is now stored across the recipients of that communication or that conversation. So if it's a group, let's argumentally say it's 10 people in the group. If you upload that document onto WhatsApp, that's 10 people that have it. That is 10 people that now have that in their backups, that at some point, if they leave your employment or another organization's employment, that data will still be stored in their backup. And it's at the point where you upload it into the WhatsApp conversation, you effectively lose control of it. And I think also the other point is also always consider and look who's on the group that you're sharing this data with. I think in the case that Dave gave, this was typically where an employee took a cell phone and took pictures of intellectual property, and then put it up onto WhatsApp. There's almost no way you're going to stop and detect that. You can rely on software, to my second last bullet point, around mobile device management, where you can implement some controls on mobile devices. But if this really is an issue for you, where you have to protect intellectual property, you really have to start considering not allowing cameras, USB, CDs, DVDs, or any device that allows them to copy or replicate the data into an environment. So you have to be proactive about classifying your data, understanding what data is important to you, and how far do you need to go to protect that data. Do personnel screening when you're hiring staff or contractors that access any sensitive data, and keep that access to a minimum. You also want to track and record who is accessing the data. I think there's so many data points and confidential data out there, and if you really want to start tracking your organization, if you do have an insider or a leak, you really want to be seeing and tying back that, if there's a leak, who's accessing this data, and build that track record and the evidence necessary to one, identify it, but also then take the necessary recourse in a disciplinary or ultimately litigation. And then, I think, publish policies around the use of social media. Is it allowed in your organization? Isn't it? What is permissible in a social media platform, and what's not permissible? Be very, very clear about that, and also ensure that you raise and do some awareness training around your policies that the company expects of staff members. I think I want to quickly touch on this, you know, and as Dave said, let me just jump to this slide first. As Dave said, we have shifted to a more modern way of working. I think, you know, working from home or remote working has definitely accelerated this, where on the left-hand side, you have the traditional sort of networks. You have your computer sitting behind a corporate environment, and typically you'd be protected by some form of firewall or some form of web server proxy that often implements this for you. And we've moved to the world where on the right-hand side, you know, if you consider yourself the laptop on the bottom left, you're now connecting to cloud platform, Azure, all sorts of cloud-based applications directly. And what we're seeing from a technical and from a technical control perspective is we're seeing all these controls are being pulled back to the endpoint, and we're starting to place less reliance on a lot of the controls in the network. So think about your context, you know, work with your IT provider to really unpack this and challenge them on some of these risks. And in some cases, consider reaching out a security professional to really give you another independent view or some advice on how you can deal with this. Just around cloud computing, I think a lot of us are starting to use providers like AWS, Azure. You know, typically on the left-hand side, for an on-premise system, you're accountable for the whole stack: applications, data, runtime, the operating system, the hardware, all of it. With cloud computing, you know, we have the concept of platform as a service. That's really where the cloud provider, Azure, AWS, and Google, they would look after the infrastructure. You know, you would still need to look after the operating system, the middleware, the run. So you need to make sure the patches are installed, the anti-malware is installed, the logs are centrally stored, and make sure all those controls are applicable. If you move on to the next one, this is really the previous one was infrastructure service. The next was platform as a service. And this is where you're starting to ingest data, and the platform is actually like Docker containers, or, you know, it spins up an environment where your data and your program runs, and it executes the data and then gives you an output. So there the service provider is responsible for the running of the programs, but what the program does and how it handles your data, you're still accountable for. And then lastly, we move on to software as a service, which is very well known. I mean, I'm thinking of Salesforce and Office 365, for example. They will effectively look after security of the whole stack, but there are controls and they give you a lot of configuration that you can configure and tweak, such as multi-factor authentication, which I strongly recommend as a minimum control for any access to sensitive data that you need to have enabled. But they give you the ability to turn these on. Take the time and review those settings and think about it from a risk point of view. What happens if and assume that you have been compromised, you know, and how do you mitigate or reduce the data that a hacker can access? I think that's it. So I think let me end that there. And if I can hand over to sorry, Mary, over to you. Before I hand over to Mary, I want to hand over to Dave first. As you said earlier on, he's very passionate about chain of custody. It is very important that when there is a cybercrime, that you take the right action, the immediate action, whether you know, and generally we'd advise to disconnect a server or a laptop, don't turn it off, and immediately get in contact with an expert. But how you handle the data and the evidence is critical to ultimate prosecution. And I'll hand over to Dave to really talk into the ins and outs of that. Thank you, Dave. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Right, thank you. All right, let me just get my screen up. Sorry, I'm battling a bit now.
Whilst you figure that out, can I ask Claus a question?
Yeah, go for it, Morris. I just noted the question from Cameron. I was also about to answer that, but do you want to ask your question?
No, cool. I see Dave's sorted, so let's hand over to Dave.
Sure. Right, thank you. Right, chain of custody. I think maybe for the average Joe citizen, it's quite a difficult concept. So what I like to say to people is think of it in the context of what we're all used to is shopping for groceries. and you have what your supermarkets and their suppliers call the cold chain. So if you take your frozen foods from the time of production and sealing and then loading into a truck, delivery at Woolworths or Pick n Pay or ShopRite or Spar or whoever, to the freezers, there's a concept called the cold chain, which maintains the integrity of that food. And if that cold chain is broken, then the food can become rotten or perish or go off. And that's absolutely critical in that particular line between the producers, the delivery people, and then the supermarket itself. That cold chain must be maintained at all costs. It's very, very similar in the evidentiary preservation and production in court or a disciplinary hearing or whatever tribunal it is, that the chain of custody is maintained. So why it's important, let me give you a simple example. In the last example that we discussed with Claus talking about the WhatsApp and the employee that took photographs of intellectual property to sell. Now, in that particular matter, we subjected the employee to a disciplinary hearing. And of course, she came with an attorney and advocate, and they claimed that we had planted that evidence on her phone. They said that she gave the phone to the company and they then planted that evidence. The photographs were there on her particular phone, and but she said she knew nothing about it. Someone had planted it. And that is your typical defense. If the evidence is compromised, it's very easy for an accused person to then get off on the basis that a judge or the chair of an inquiry is not going to be confident that that risk is not there, that that evidence is compromised. And that's why, as an investigator, you need to make certain that that chain of custody is maintained. So you're gathering the evidence for whatever tribunal it is, be it a disciplinary hearing or a civil matter or a criminal matter, and you need to maintain that chain from the first point of the data collection. So from the time that you collect the evidence through the examination, the analysis, the report, and the presentation to the court, you need to maintain that particular chain. So that is simply to avoid any suggestion that that evidence has been tampered with or compromised in any way. So my first bit of advice would be limit the number of people handling that evidence. That's critical, because the more people that handle it, the more risk there is of compromise or that chain of custody being broken. So there's no need for 5 or 6 people to be present and to handle a hard drive that is being cloned, for example, or data that's been extracted. Have one person that can start the process and start documenting it from the time they start to the time they finish, as opposed to a whole a number of people. So you limit the number of people that deal with it. Common sense here to me is paramount. Think about it. If you are going to go and testify before a judge that you have done an investigation into a hack or a data breach, and you're now presenting the evidence on the basis that the chain of custody has been maintained, what would the judge want to know? Well, first of all, he'd want to know how things started. So you must then document it. As at 10:45 on 9 October 2020, I, Dave Loxton, did the following. I was engaged by company X to take possession of a laptop. The serial number of the laptop is the following. And so you document all that from A to Z with meticulous attention to detail. So you confirm that all that evidence is now documented, and it must then be maintained. So if I'm given a laptop, I will then give that evidence I've just mentioned, document it. Then that laptop must be sealed, so that when it leaves my possession, if that seal is broken, I know that the laptop might have been compromised. So you seal it in a form that it's obvious if someone has now tampered with it or broken that particular chain. Excuse me. You not only must you identify the item itself, be a laptop or a flash disk, and or a USB drive, whatever it is, but the individual dealing with it must be documented. The location must be documented, and quite honestly, there's nothing like photographs to back it up. So if you suspect you're going to be testifying in court and you are now starting a chain of custody from beginning to end, you're maintaining it and you are documenting it, take photographs of the laptop that you've taken possession of. Show the serial number. The photograph also prints out the time, the date, and you can show the location, might be someone's office or whatever. So you really need to pay that attention to detail, because believe you me, I'm an ex-prosecutor. There's nothing worse than presenting a matter in court where you know that you have enough evidence to prove someone's guilt, but because that chain of custody has been broken, that person walks free, because the defense can show that at some stage their laptop, for example, was not in your possession, it was vulnerable for someone to access, that there's a possibility that someone planted in information on that particular laptop, and the judge then says, well, I can't accept this, there is that possibility, this evidence is now not, it won't be admitted. So my advice would be, when you are investigating some kind of compromise or cyber breach, get the experts involved. Nothing freaks me more, and I don't want to criticize in-house IT people, but very few in-house IT people have the knowledge of investigating and maintaining this chain of custody. What happens is, if a client says to me, we've had a hack, but don't worry, my internal IT guys are on it, they've already cloned hard drives, taken possession of laptops, I know 9 times out of 10 that evidence is inadmissible. It will have been compromised because they simply don't understand the importance of maintaining that particular chain. So if you do have a breach, I really strongly urge you to get the experts involved immediately. You need to, as Claus said, limit your risks, so you can shut down your server, for example, but then call in forensic IT experts who actually know how to maintain this chain of custody. And I strongly suggest you get your in-house counsel or your lawyer, your external counsel involved as well, to supervise the whole process. Someone that actually has experience in litigation, that knows how to present evidence in a court of law. They will then understand how critical it is to maintain that chain. Okay, so that's what I would like to say on chain of custody, how fundamentally critical it is. And believe you me, it's not just for court hearings. I have had a number of cases where, for internal disciplinary hearings as well, the employees take the point that evidence was planted on their laptop or planted on their cell phone, and you then need to deal with that chain of custody. And again, there are very few internal human resource people or in-house managers who understand how to present this evidence in a disciplinary hearing, and 9 times out of 10 it'll be thrown out or inadmissible, or if it is admitted in the disciplinary hearing, it gets to the CCMA and they then throw it out as inadmissible. So you actually need to get this right. So a very important point that Claus and I have discussed before this, and we felt it's important to bring it to all of your attention. Right, so I think that that then brings us to question and answer. If that's all I wanted to say on chain of custody. So we're ready for engagement and questions.
We've got an interesting one here, and I guess would apply to Dropbox. I recall several years ago, I think it was Worksman's or Weber Wenzel law firm decided to actually move away from Dropbox because they were concerned with the security. And there's a question here in relation to that. What is your take on the cloud?
Right, so yeah, no, so let me deal with that. So look, I think whenever you contract a cloud provider or you subscribe to any cloud services, you know, there's an agreement that you sign, and again, to one of my previous slides, there's the responsibility of that provider, and they have the responsibility often of taking care of all the security of the infrastructure, the software. But you also have to do your research and I think ultimately ask for some evidence that they do indeed practice good security in this space, and those come in the form of certifications that you can ask for, and I think you have every right to ask for it, and I think you have actually the responsibility to ask for it, to investigate the provider up front. But you know, test them and consider and apply your minds on, are they applying reasonable security, you know, and how do they handle data in flow? How do they store data? Do they encrypt the data? There's some easy questions you can ask, and you can also just, you know, if you just do a bit of research on the internet, there's some practical advice as to how you can assess these vendors. You know, there's a question specifically in the chat window about, can you back up, and is it sufficient enough to back up your data to the cloud, OneDrive? Now, you know, I can't speak on Microsoft behalf, but in terms of OneDrive and from my experience, if you're using the free version of OneDrive, it, as far as I know, allows you to do one backup. Now, it also has the agents and the capability to sync your data. Now, if your computer is affected by ransomware and all that data is encrypted and the agent still runs, it's going to sync your encrypted data up to the cloud. And in that case, OneDrive, Dropbox, many of those that don't maintain a version history of that data is not sufficient. And you still need to consider offline backups in those cases. OneDrive for Business, as far as I know, does provide an opportunity where you can restore previous versions of the files. And I would urge you to test that actually by, just a text file, change it, and then, or create a text file, change it, and then see how far back can you actually restore that, do a practical test. And in those cases, you would be able to recover in terms of ransomware from that in many cases.
Claus,
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, but just playing from that question, what's your take on these password apps where passwords are stored in the cloud? Is that advisable? What do you suggest? Like one password is an app, and I know it's in the cloud, but I've got it syncs across all my devices. They say that it's very, very safe, but I kind of feel uncomfortable.
So yeah, look, you are putting all your keys to the kingdom or your secrets into a cloud provider that is online available. So again, you have a attack surface that's open to be exploited or attacked. But again, you have to do the research. Are they doing the necessary, applying the security controls? So do your research of that company. I think with these password vaults, there's a lot of convenience that comes with that, because now you have passwords all over the show, in a single place across all your devices that you can now access easily. I think the trade-off here is, passwords and some of the advice we have and what we see often is someone would use one secure password, and it's difficult to remember a secure password. And what people would typically do is they'd use that same password on 10, 20, 30 websites, maybe hundreds. And what we've seen is that other websites, and there's known breaches, if you look at, there's a known website called Have I Been Pawned? And if you type your email address in there, it'll tell you where your email address and perhaps password was already compromised on another system. Now, if you use the same password on that website and you're using it on 10 other websites, your details is out in the public, your password. So to guard against that, the advice is to use different passwords for sites. And somehow you've got to get a system as to how you manage all the different passwords. So that could either be through a formula. So maybe there's some nuances to your password you change based on the website that you or a system that you can remember. But that's where password vaults really do become very helpful in having different passwords. But again, the risk there is if your master key is compromised, all your passwords are compromised. And if you do rely on one of those services, also think about setting up emergency access where you could have a family member that could gain access to that after 7 days, if you're not available, for example, so that if something does happen to you, there are certain passwords that you might want to share with others in certain situations.
Fantastic. I see we're out of time. Very, very grateful to you, grateful to the audience and the Facebook audience for joining today. Please join us next week. We've got another webinar. As I said at the beginning of this show, we have webinars every week. Please go to our website, www.cobra.org.za. We have a knowledge base there. It deals with everything related to COBRA. It has various tools that you can make use of. Thanks so much to the audience. Thanks so much to the panelists. You guys have been absolutely fantastic. We will get you back. So until next time, cheers. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.